Absolutely. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the effect of acute stress and acute adversity on psychological functioning from a slightly different point of view. I'm going to consider particularly its effects on the social environment and social behavior and tease out the implications of that for psychological functioning. So I'm going to persuade you or try to persuade you that acute adversity can improve psychological functioning. I'm hearing a car beeping. I'm not sure if how I live in New York City, unfortunately. So hopefully that will stop. Okay, it did. So um, so I'm going to try to persuade you that this happens, that there's some sound explanations for it, and I'm going to present some evidence to support this point of view. Um, so I've given it this kind of title, Psychosocial Gains from Adversity, and I'll try to explain, to some degree, its differences from post-traumatic growth. Um, so just want to acknowledge some of my collaborators, as well as the World Trade Center Health Registry. I'll use some of their data, and of course my lab, which helps me in many ways and has participated in this research. So I want to start by considering some past kind of seismic examples, so to speak, of acute adversity. So the San Francisco earthquake did immense damage in San Francisco 100 or so years ago, and razed most of the city, in fact, because of the fires that resulted. Another example closer to our experience is the World Trade Center attacks, which many of us do recall quite well. I lived in New York City at the time. And obviously it had a tremendous impact, not just on New York, but on the country and the world, in fact. Now, when we think about these events, we think about them, of course, in terms of their traumatic impact, and that is obviously appropriate. But the first person accounts can sometimes provide an interesting perspective. So after the great San Francisco earthquake, Dorothy Day, one of my heroes, said, "What I remember most plainly about the earthquake was the human warmth and kindliness of everyone afterward." She was a child when the earthquake occurred, and she viewed the earthquake as a fundamental experience, and it may have shaped her becoming one of the great humanitarians and labor activists of the 20th century. Another example, the spirit of this people is the most wonderful thing I've dreamed of, and this was from a survivor's letter. We can look at the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and this is from Rebecca Solnitz's book, A Paradise Built in Hell. It was both a horrible and a wonderful experience at the same time. I felt that sense of collectivity I've experienced only rarely in my life, and it's always been in the face of tremendous horror. So both of these events stimulated an intense awareness of other people. And I think that one of the things that acute stress can do is make us aware of other people, and we can feel it in these first-person descriptions. So in this talk, I want to make three primary points. I want to suggest that acute stress can result in improved functioning directly following exposure. So this is not a reconstructive process. This is not, a sort of working it out and thinking it through. This is a direct impact of the event itself. I want to suggest that the reason for that is that it stimulates social affiliative behavior, cooperative behavior, post-social behavior. And These behaviors, experiences, they can involve simply being aware of other people, the accessibility, perhaps even of representations of other people. All of these can improve psychological functioning. Um, so you might ask, well, why has this been ignored? Well, and clearly there are perspectives that recognize the beneficial effects of stress, but the particular effects I'm going to identify have gone neglected, I believe. So one of them is an assumption of universal harm. We have a long belief, long history of believing that traumatization typically occurs. We have often ignored heterogeneity, that is, that people react in different ways. And so that when we ignore that heterogeneity, we can miss people who have improved because the average will can necessarily obscure it. We often use designs that don't involve a pre-event assessment, and this is a basic issue with stress research because you don't know when traumatic events are going to occur. And if we measure people after event, then after an event occurs, we can't determine what their functioning was like before. So the assumption of universal harm it necessarily implies that we wouldn't see people improving, and psychosocial gains would not be possible. But we know, of course, that most people are resilient, and indeed this research group is testimony to that. So most people do not suffer significant or long-lasting effects of acute adversity. PTSD prevalence, even to the worst events, is almost always less than 30%. Another issue is heterogeneity. So we know that individual differences are the rule. People respond in widely different ways to acute stress. And we've had difficulty capturing this heterogeneity, and the statistical techniques, especially as they apply to trauma research, have really only emerged in the last 10 years. Latent trajectory, latent growth mixture modeling, group-based modeling, these approaches are they've been around, but they have only recently been applied to acute stress. And that was sort of my early work, focused on using these techniques to figure out those patterns along with George Bonanno. So mixture distributions typically characterize the stress response. And a mixture distribution, of course, is a sort of jumble of different distributions where essentially what you should do is separate the populations and treat each of them as their own grouping. And latent trajectory techniques do just that. They use empirical criteria to figure out kind of where you define a given grouping. And this is just a sort of representation of that. And when you do that, you find that in fact people group into different categories. So resilience is one grouping, PTSD is another, but I'm going to suggest that psychosocial gains is also a response to acute stress. So a third obstacle is lack of pre-event designs. So it's very difficult to document psychosocial gains without data on pre-event functioning. You can do it. There's ways around that, but it makes it more difficult. And pre-event data are, of course, extremely rare. In one review of the disaster literature, only 7 of 160 studies included pre-event data. So I'm going to borrow a slide from George Bonanno here and adapt it. This is his typology of responses to acute stress and the percentages associated with it. Now, what I want to suggest is that because most studies are conducted after the event, we don't know what's happening before. And there's a number of possibilities. So one possibility is that the resilience group actually represents, at least in part, a group that has seen improved functioning, so that resilience could include people who have improved. And we wouldn't know that unless we measured them before the event happened. So, so I describe these effects as psychosocial gains from adversity, and I define them as marked improvement on a dimension of psychological functioning that directly follows exposure to either an isolated and highly adverse events, such as a natural disaster, violent or life-threatening experience, or terrorist attack, or a major stressful life event, such as bereavement, divorce, or major illness. So I summarized this point of view in an article in Psychological Review in 2019. If you're curious to look at it in more detail. So psychosocial gains from adversity looks at adversity from a multi-level point of view. So there's the level of the individual and the level of the group. Stress stimulates affiliative behavior through oxytocin. What it essentially does is sensitize us to social information. That appears to be the role of oxytocin. It makes us more sensitive, and that can actually have positive and negative implications depending on the response you get from others. Now, if we scale this up to a group level, we have an environment characterized by more trust, cooperation, social interaction, meaningful conversation. And these two things can work together. And when we get positive social feedback, that further stimulates social interaction, and you can create a pro-social environment through that means. And it turns out that the positive effects of oxytocin are dependent on positive social feedback. If we don't get, if our overtures are not reciprocated, then we feel worse. And oxytocin has an anxiogenic effect instead of an anxiolytic effect. And when we put all of these things together, we get better emotion regulation, we get better well-being, we get reduced distress, we get improved relationships. And so these are obvious dimensions of improved psychological functioning. Now, there is, in fact, quite a bit of empirical evidence that people do improve after acute adversity. And these are studies that have used prospective pre-event designs, and in most cases, but not all, some kind of latent trajectory approach. And sometimes in the whole sample, you'll see this effect. It'll be a main effect. You won't even have to pull apart the trajectories. So this is a study we did with the Virginia Tech campus shootings, and this depended on some data that my colleagues Heather Littleton and Amy Grills collected purely coincidentally before the shootings occurred. And what we found was that anxiety symptoms in 13% of the sample showed a marked reduction, a very large reduction in terms of the degree of anxiety. So this was 13% of the sample. We got the same result when we looked at depression. This was a smaller group, but nevertheless, they also showed improvement. We can find these effects as well when we consider bereavement. So this is a study where we looked at subjective well-being, and we found that 5% of the sample showed an improvement in subjective well-being. Here is another study. This was from George Bonanno, and he found a group, about 11%, that showed a marked reduction in depression. And we can think of a few reasons why that might have been the case. But one of them is, and I've reanalyzed these data. One of them is that there's dimensions of the social environment that can actually improve after a loss. Military deployment is another example of an acute stressor that often shows improved functioning in PTSD. Now, you might ask, how did you measure PTSD? You can index PTSD before deployment to another event and then measure it after deployment. And in this study that we did in the British Journal of Psychiatry, we found that 8% of the sample saw a reduction in PTSD. Other studies have found this as well. So this was a study of Marines in a very high combat region, the Helmand province, and they also found a pretty large proportion that saw a reduction in PTSD, although the researchers ignored it, which is quite common. A few other examples, cancer shows this pattern as well. Here it's about 8%. And in a student sample, we found it after Hurricane Sandy. So global distress actually declined among students after the hurricane. And this is in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. In another Hurricane Sandy sample, this was a probability sample, and these effects were smaller, but nevertheless, there were fewer days of poor mental health. There was a slight increase in life satisfaction, general health, and a reduction in reported PTSD symptoms. Again, the magnitude of these effects were small, but nevertheless, they're counterintuitive, and support this idea. So the improved functioning pattern consistently emerged. The proportion of people varied from about 5 to 14%, but in some cases, if you had a whole sample, you could find improvement, as in the case of the hurricane. This occurs after widely ranging event types, so it is not dependent on a particular kind of acute stressor. And the effect sizes, when you isolate the improving pattern, are often extremely large, so more than a standard deviation. So I think that argues against a kind of regression to the mean, explanation. Now, how does this happen? How do psychosocial gains from adversity occur? Well, there's actually a long history of documenting these effects in sociological, historical studies of disaster with colorful names: post-disaster utopia, a paradise built in hell, city of comrades, democracy of distress, altruistic community. I think we can all easily summon the idea of people sort of banding together, working together to deal with some form of acute stress. And we know that acute adversity strengthens trustworthiness, and cooperation. This is in laboratory studies. It increases affiliative behavior, or tend and befriend. That's Shelley Taylor's work. It can serve as social glue. That's Brock Bastian. And it can increase social connections and altruism. This was after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Fowler and Christakis have done very interesting work on cooperative cascades, where cooperation travels from person to person to person. Now, if we think about this, if we think about this idea of automatic affiliative behavior, we know that when people are in distress, we seek to comfort them. And that is just a natural tendency when we're afflicted. When we're mutually afflicted, we band together. If someone is in some kind of bad, if they've experienced some unfortunate event, then we move toward them. So this is a natural human tendency. It's almost certainly evolutionarily, programmed, and when we scale that up, we can create again a more cooperative and trusting environment. This is after the Virginia Tech shootings. There were many rituals where people came together. Now, is there more direct evidence of this? Well, we found that social support increased after the Virginia Tech campus shootings. So the improvement group showed a dramatic increase in social support, whereas the other groups showed only a modest increase, although overall there was an increase in social support. And we found this also in our Hurricane Sandy study. This was, again, a college student sample, and the degree of social support increased in the hurricane semester, whereas it decreased in the other semesters. In fact, attachment avoidance even decreased among the hurricane sample. So we saw evidence that attachment avoidance, which is usually a trait-like phenomenon, also decreased. And when we look at prosocial aspects of functioning, we found that in a severe hurricane sample, we found that things like evacuation or having your home flooded or even your home being damaged predicted both perceptions of support, so that implies that people were being more supportive, as you might expect, but we also found that those people were more likely to volunteer, and that they engaged in more tasks of volunteering. So prosocial behavior also resulted from more severe exposure from the hurricane. And this was after we controlled for, age, gender, ethnicity, income, education. And in the perceived support, we also had a baseline level of social support, so we could look at the increase. So this was a stronger design for that reason. What about, so how can we find evidence that in fact these phenomena are linked? Well, the straightforward way to look at it would be in a kind of mediational approach. And in fact, we found that in the hurricane cohort in our student sample, their social support increased over the semester, and that resulted in a decrease in global distress. So here again, we controlled for baseline pre-event social support and distress, and we found a mediational effect. So in fact, the hurricane, through social support, appeared to reduce global distress. It also increased positive affect, reduced negative affect, increased self-esteem, reduced attachment avoidance even. So all of these effects were significant. And again, this is in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin paper that came out this year. In a parallel analysis where we looked at this was a large sample, a probability sample after Hurricane Sandy. When people's homes were flooded, they perceived more social support. They were more likely to engage in pro-social volunteering. So these effects were quite strong. And that predicted increases in life satisfaction. These effects were not as strong, but they nevertheless were significant. And here again, we controlled for life satisfaction before the storm, and social support before the storm, as well as demographics. And so these indirect effects were both significant. And, so it essentially implied that the people who had their homes flooded, when they engaged in more volunteering and when they experienced more social support, actually saw an increase in their life satisfaction, even after home flooding. And these effects were present for evacuation and for home damage. And they also appeared for optimism and compassion. Let's talk a little about COVID. So COVID-19 obviously has had massive effects. It, especially early on, generated a lot of worry, and understandably so. And COVID is an unusual stressor because it, especially as well as we've seen, and especially at the beginning, was rapidly changing, multifaceted. It certainly could enhance stress. There were wide-ranging effects, but it also could reduce stress. Fewer daily hassles, work, commuting. You can perhaps feel closer to others. That, again, is the psychosocial gains perspective. You might be more aware of others or feel more compassion. And the balance of these effects would vary actually quite a bit. They could depend on the person, on the particular situation they're in, and at a socio-cultural level as well. Now, I want to suggest that normative anxiety, which would be appropriate for COVID-19, actually can have some beneficial effects. So COVID-19 worry was associated with social behavior. So how often did you talk on the phone with friends and relatives? So we found this among college students. We also found it in a cross-national sample, one in the US and one in Italy. We'll be publishing that soon. And what was interesting is that COVID-19 worry stimulated social affiliative behavior, and that actually reduced loneliness. So worrying about, so in fact, the impact of the pandemic had some favorable effects when it increased social or affiliative behavior. So again, this was a mediational analysis. This was not a longitudinal analysis, to be clear. And the same, but we replicated this effect. This was pre-registered. We got the same result where COVID-19 worry was associated with social affiliative behavior across 2 countries, and resulted in increased well-being. So these findings suggest that a mechanism of improvement, a mechanism of psychosocial gains, is social behavior. But are there some constraints on psychosocial gains? Well, of course there must be. So contextual factors could play a role. Is your neighborhood more cohesive or more trusting? That could put a boundary, or it could increase the likelihood of psychosocial gains. The nature of the event could certainly place a boundary on it. So interpersonal violence, physical assault, sexual assault, I don't think those events would be likely to result in psychosocial gains for obvious reasons, primarily having to do with their effects on the social realm. In other words, those kinds of events can induce shame. They can induce a sense of guilt. Those emotions make you feel isolated and less likely to engage with others. And I think that's one way of understanding PTSD reactions, is that the sense of kind of isolation, of sort of being alone with this acute stressor can, I think, play a role in PTSD. And of course, there's individual differences. So some people are more susceptible to the environment. There's this idea of differential susceptibility to the environment. Some of us are just sort of more permeable. We kind of absorb more from the environment. And so there are going to be some constraints, and we can think about them at the individual and the environmental level. So we did look at one of them, social cohesion. So in our Hurricane Sandy sample, we had a measure of social cohesion. Would that enhance the effects of the hurricane on social and pro-social behaviors and experiences? And if it does, then you could see a sort of amplification of the beneficial effects. In fact, we did find some evidence for that. So the indirect effect was considerably stronger when the social cohesion was high. So so both social support and volunteering were moderated by social cohesion. So the social environment did seem to play a role, as would be expected in environments that are more cohesive. You saw more volunteering and people experienced more social support. So people do commonly experience improved functioning after acute adversity. And I think the primary explanation is that it favorably influences social processes and pro-social behavior, which mediate the effects of the adversity and can produce more adaptive psychological functioning. And there are some factors that are nevertheless going to constrain this. Now, so just a few final thoughts. So I think one way to think about adversity, and this is, in some ways controversial, is as a sort of valence neutral event. Valence neutral in the sense that it's a kind of energetic input, and its consequences can be both positive and negative. I'm not suggesting that it's equal. It's obviously more likely to have negative consequences, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the positive ones that occur in the moment. So this is, again, not a theory in which it requires a lot of reconstructive processes, a lot of rumination. This is a theory that suggests that these events, this phenomena occurs immediately. It doesn't depend on us making sense of the experience. It just depends on us obeying kind of evolutionarily programmed instincts to seek out others and for others to seek us out. So the context obviously matters. Our social behavior is exquisitely calibrated, and things like trust, for example, are necessarily a calculation. So trust is a very important component, because we can trust and we can not trust, and the environment has a lot to do with that. And environments that are conducive toward trust are going to have beneficial effects, because trust itself has beneficial psychological consequences. It's also possible that socialization can take place. In other words, we might alter our beliefs about other people. We might sort of embrace a more kind of cooperative worldview. And in fact, Dorothy Day, as I mentioned, saw the earthquake as a fundamental formative experience for her. And we can also think about this from an evolutionary point of view. So psychosocial gains are consistent with reciprocal altruism, in which we are altruistic with an expectation of some return. And reciprocal altruism is, again, a beneficial behavior, but it's one that is contingent on a calculation of future benefit. And for us to engage in that behavior, it should be rewarding, and rewarding behaviors should make us feel good, should make us feel better, should help our psychological functioning. So, so affiliative behavior itself and should be rewarding. We should get a benefit from that through a kind of evolutionarily kind of programmed reward. So that's sort of the kind of summary here. Um, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was really interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Please feel free to use the chat or the raise hand function, or just speak out loud if you do.
Okay, I see Carol, and I thought I saw Ellie.
I think those were applause rather than.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I'll take.
I'll take what I can get. Jay, sorry.
We were clapping, but I'll take the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm not an expert in the area at all, but just wondering if other characteristics of the event itself could also moderate this.
Yeah.
For example, how rare, you say in English, how rare is the event? Because one event that in principle might seem, like dramatic, let's say a bomb or something, at certain point in time, let's say here in Colombia with the drug cartels war plus guerrilla plus everything, a bomb was not that rare. And it wouldn't probably trigger the reaction as you would in another context. So that's one thing. And the other one is, I'm wondering if the response will trigger when you identify more similar to the people in the situation. In some countries, the response triggers because it affects to others that you perceive as more like you. But then when there's migrants coming from a war situation, life-threatening situation, but you perceive them more removed from your own reality. I don't know how to express, but you know what I mean? Then maybe it's different. So just one.
Those are excellent points. So I if an event, just to answer your first question, if an event is not so unpredictable, in other words, you're more accustomed to it, and even as you say, even something like bombings, I imagine once you're accustomed to it, it's not going to have the same impact. So I would agree that that an event that is not outside of the range of even if you're used to that event, then it's not going to have the same effects. I certainly think that's the case. In terms of whether you sort of identify with or feel sort of connected to the group that's afflicted, I think that would also have an effect. And so that, again, that would be a kind of evolutionary perspective, a kind of, sometimes, there's work on in-group and out-group. So there is some evidence that stress can facilitate a group identity, but that group identity could be opposed to another group. So those are some of the mixed effects, and so that can actually have some negative consequences too. After the great earthquake in Tokyo in the 30s, there was a lot of intracommunal violence actually against the Korean population. And that had something to do with people binding together and also resource scarcity. So resource scarcity will be particularly an issue under those circumstances. So those are excellent points. Thank you for that. Jay, did you have a question?
I did. First of all, thanks very much for the interesting talk, Anthony. And it's always great to hear a fellow Italian rise to the top of his profession. So,
Thank you.
Excellent.
Likewise.
I really appreciate the fact you're saying, let's change the assumptions we're making about people and their personalities and how they respond. I really appreciate that theme in your work. I was also struck, I think there's a theme among apparently a lot of the samples, maybe your own samples and others. There's a certain number of people that apparently are high on efficacy or self-efficacy, it would seem. So that that as the challenge comes along, it like unleashes, if you will,
Yes.
whatever's in them that is efficacious. So I wonder if you just comment on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does present a kind of opportunity. And, I think if you feel yourself to be efficacious as a person, then you will take advantage of that. And, I think it's also probably the case that you feel like you can do something. And that feeling in itself, which is a kind of efficacy, could be beneficial. And again, could be mutually reinforcing as other people kind of feel the same thing. Thanks for that, Jay. Other questions?
There's a hand up from Irene.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you very much, Anthony, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I have two questions, but perhaps I should start with one in case others want to ask questions, and then I come back to the other, or shall I ask both now and it's up to you?
You can launch.
Okay, okay. The first one is, have you seen similar patterns in any research that you have done personally or that you are aware of with children? So in other words, Are we talking about the universal sort of human experience, or is there room to think that children may respond differently? Or do you think this is just universal across ages and stages?
Yeah.
And the second one is, have you done any work, or are you familiar with any work that can actually show how we can build resilience for the future?
Yeah. So to the first question, there is some data on children, actually. So there's some interesting data on the oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in Texas. This was 10 years or so ago, that did identify groups of children who showed this effect. So there's a more of a scant record, but there is some evidence that this can happen among children. Of course, one of our studies was with undergraduates who were primarily freshmen, so they were around 18. And so there's reasons to think that this can happen with children, but it's always difficult to make, to generalize from adults to kids. So I think it requires certainly some additional data, and I think it would also probably have some other moderators that would play a role here.
I would imagine.
Now, I'm sorry, your second question.
The second question is, have you done any work on how to build, how to build resilience for the future? Obviously you cannot anticipate the next catastrophe, but if there is a broad sort of sets of skills that are ideally teachable and trainable.
Yeah, well, I do think that an awareness of this phenomenon is important in itself. And that obeying the kind of instinct to interact is generally a wise thing to do. We tend to trust too little, not too much, and so I think an awareness of this can be beneficial. I think simply knowing that you are not necessarily traumatized by an experience is helpful as well. Again, it's not to diminish the possibility of trauma, which is obviously real, but it is to suggest that it is, I think, helpful at least to make people aware that they can get through this, and that the social mechanisms are a potent way to manage acute stress. So I do think that's neglected, honestly. This is not necessarily about CBT. No. This is not necessarily about reworking our thoughts. This is really about behaviors interactions, conversations that don't necessarily involve the event itself. So it's not required that you talk about the experience in this framework. Just ordinary social interaction, even about topics that are totally unrelated, can be beneficial. So I think that is different than the sort of dominant point of view, which emphasizes, not catastrophizing or, reconstructing or that kind of thing, restructuring. So, but thanks for those questions. Ellie, do you have a question? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that really interesting talk. I was just wondering, you said that the phenomenon of psychosocial gains kind of occurs immediately after the event.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how the impacts might change over time. So have you collected similar data at different time points, such as maybe like 6 months after the event? Because I know in the disaster literature, there's often talks of like a honeymoon phase where there's really strong social cohesion, and actually over time that can kind of dissipate if there's dissatisfaction with the recovery process taking longer than they hoped, or if there's inequalities. So yeah, I'm just wondering if this phenomenon holds.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And so the effects can endure, but they depend on an environment that supports them. So we found after the Virginia Tech campus shootings that students were doing better a year after. So they were, durable. And I think in that case, they were durable because they created new relationships that carried forward. In some disaster environments, you're absolutely right, things get worse. And especially severe disasters that impede access to other people, that kind of have structural effects on the social environment, that is going to place a necessary constraint. And so those effects could certainly be reversed, and there's evidence that they do. There was an interesting study recently done among married couples after a hurricane, and they found that there's a sort of general decline in marital satisfaction. I mean, not a huge one, but there's, it's high at first and then it goes down a bit. It appeared that the hurricane reversed this process. And this was actually in Psychological Science a month or two ago. And so they experienced an increase in marital satisfaction after the hurricane. And that actually lasted for a while, but then of course it also decayed. But you're probably better off than you were without the hurricane. I mean, I think that's kind of the point. But the durability of these effects is dependent on a lot of other factors. So, but it's an excellent it's an excellent point.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I had one more comment, Anthony, about the Virginia Tech shootings. I was on the faculty at that time.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and I was on the tech faculty for a total of 32 years, but at any rate, what I recall about my own behavior, and I wasn't on campus at the time, I was at home, but I recall about my own behavior and sentiment, and many others, is to go to the campus, not exactly sure why, but to be there. And a lot of faculty and a lot of staff went to the campus. There weren't classes, and everything was disruptive, but people had this sense to be present and to be there in that physical space. I don't know that I can make sense of it all even today, but I know that's what people did. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, and I think that's exactly right. So there's a strange kind of we feel impelled toward that kind of disaster that happened after 9/11, where of course volunteers flooded to the site of the disaster, and there was a kind of magnetism to it. You felt drawn toward it. You felt it was important to be there, even if you weren't exactly sure why. So I think it's a really good point.
We have Ellie again.
Sorry, just another quick question. I was just wondering if there's any difference between the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth and the psychosocial gains for adversity. They sound quite similar, so I'm wondering if there's any kind of overlap or any differences between those ideas.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and I sometimes think I should make that a little more explicit. So post-traumatic growth predicts that after you experience the traumatic event and you have some traumatic effects, so you do have PTSD symptoms, you do ruminate about the event, you think about it, gradually as you sort of reconstruct your understanding of the experience, as you kind of climb out of it slowly, you eventually arrive on the other side and you are better off for having experienced that event. So, so post-traumatic growth is really about a kind of internal psychological process that occurs. Psychosocial gains is really about a kind of automatic affiliative behavior that has direct consequences for immediate psychological functioning. It does not require that we reconstruct the experience. It doesn't require that we be traumatized. So that is a presumption of post-traumatic growth. So it's quite different in its focus. Post-traumatic growth also is heavily dependent on retrospective accounts of the effect of adversity. So that's a methodological problem, I think, with post-traumatic growth, because it does hinge very much on our capacity to look in the past and say, well, I am better off because this adversity occurred to me. Whereas psychosocial gains is looking at how people are functioning, comparing how they're functioning now to how they were functioning before the event, and then looking to see if there's some explanation in terms of our social behavior or the social environment for any beneficial effects.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for the really interesting and engaging questions. And thank you once again to Anthony for the really interesting talk. I think based on the time, we should probably close the questions down there. But we have had one more in the chat, Anthony, which is, would you be willing to make your slides available after the talk?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I can send you I can send you them. I'm happy to.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We hope you've enjoyed the talk, and we hope to see you again next month.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. What great questions, and nice to see you, Jay, after our conversation. But what great questions. I really enjoyed them.